All right, welcome back to the channel. So, looks like Devin Haney versus Gary Russell Jr. or Gary Russell Jr. versus Devin Haney is very likely to happen. They reached a preliminary agreement and are now in talks with the Zone to get the fight done with the money. So everything's looking good, man, for Devin Haney and Gervonta and Gary Russell Jr. But seeing as I was personally witness to what was going on, things are looking real bad for Leo Santa Cruz and the PBC. Dog, no, man. I've seen it now. Let's talk about how DAZN outplayed the PBC in this fight. And you know I don't even like to say these things, but I'm going to tell you, it's what it is. Let's talk about it in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So, Gary Russell Jr., the WBC 126-pound champion, called out Terence Bud Crawford, 147 pounds, and everybody acted like it was a joke. Nobody pushed the fight to happen. Terence Crawford acted like he didn't want the fight. People acting like Gary Russell Jr. is pretending and that he's faking and that he really doesn't want the fights. But I sat on a live stream. I myself spoke to Gary Russell Jr., spoke to Team Devin Haney. We had a whole big 2-day conversation going over the channel about the fight, dude. And let me tell you, 100%, dude, Gary Russell Jr. would have fought Terence Crawford for $1.5 million. For $1.5 million, and he would have given Terence Crawford a rematch clause in case he lost. In case Terence Crawford lost. Gary Russell Jr. was 100% serious about that fight, and you know it now because of what happened with Devin Haney, who may not have the prestige the same prestige and the same reputation at this point that Terence Crawford has, but he is every bit the up-and-coming champion that Terence Crawford was at that time of his career. So Gary Russell Jr., people were saying he didn't want to fight, Terence Crawford. He was just capping and all of that stuff, right? And then he moves on and people are like, oh, you just capping about Devin Haney. You don't really ever want to fight nobody. You don't want to fight anybody. You only fighting once a year, all of that. Dog, all that's out the window. All of it is out the window. Because I see why Gary Russell Jr. only fights once a year. Because people don't want to fight him. They don't want to fight him. It has nothing to do with him being difficult in negotiations, and I witnessed it. Most people that got to see something over the weekend, or actually definitely yesterday on the show, got to see something that you will rarely ever see, which is a real-time negotiation for a championship fight between two camps. We had Team Gary Russell Jr. We had Team Devin Haney, and as not a lot of people know, well, some people know, but in my living, I'm involved in negotiations a good bit. I've got a certificate, or I got certifications from Harvard University for negotiations, mastery in negotiations. I've worked in those areas for a long time, done a lot of negotiated a lot of agreements for transactions related to services and goods. So for me, it wasn't very hard to facilitate that meeting and have those guys get to the point where they could talk to each other and come around to an agreement, because ultimately, dude, both Gary Russell Jr. and Devin Haney wanted to make money. They both want, but the difficulty comes with the fact that they both want to beat each other up, right? So I'm sitting there listening to the two guys talk, and I'm separating everything in my mind. Like, okay, guy number one, Devin wants money. He wants $1.5 million, and he wants a shot at Gary Russell Jr. Gary Russell Jr. wants $1.5 million, and he wants to beat up Devin Haney. But in the conversations, there's, different things going on, other people, and it got tough to be made. But eventually, and not too much effort, they came around to an agreement, because they both found, by talking enough to each other, a zone of possibility that they could work in, right? It's like, if you can't give me exactly what I want, well, what can you give me that I may want that can work with me, right? So you go back and forth, right? You have your initial what you want, right? He has what you want. The other guy should have the bare minimum that he is willing to walk away with. Like, if you don't give me this, anything less than this or different than this, I'm going to walk away. Both parties had that. That's called your BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. They worked within their zone of possibility, and boom, there you go. DAZN USA was listening to the live stream, listened to the whole negotiation, and entered in the negotiation and said, hey, man, this fight is fire. They got off the phone. They went right. They talked to DAZN. My understanding is from, and because I'm clearly not involved in that stuff, right? They got out of that initial meeting, which was designed to produce a term sheet. And so they got to those basic bare knuckle agreements, got to the bare agreements, and they went to the networks and got it done, right? So my thing is, there's no reason that these fights can't take place. There's no reason. People say that Gary Russell Jr. is very, very difficult to negotiate with. Dude, he wasn't. He was not difficult to negotiate with at all. Al Heyman is clearly not difficult to negotiate with because look, all the parties were there. All the parties were there, right? And that Team Haney was talking to DAZN, talking to Eddie Hearn. Team Gary Russell had talked to PBC, had talked to Al Heyman. So everybody knew what they were talking about, but the fighters had to get to something on a piece of paper where they were like, okay, I can go this way or I can go that way. So you can see that they both had free agent status. So if one needed to go one way, the other one could go the other way. It was just, they had enough room to make that fight. And it was beautiful to see that fight get made. And hopefully it gets all the way to fruition because, a lot of times after you get your initial offer or you get your initial stuff together and you guys come to an agreement in principle, there could be some, different tangles, different things you still got to talk about. Is it going to be on pay-per-view? Is it going to be on ESPN Plus? All that stuff can be worked out away from the fighters as long as the fighters know, look, man, we're getting 1.5 million, especially if you're getting 1.5 million and not one, right? So if they don't want to do pay-per-view, shoot, all you got to do is say, okay, well, what's the value of it? How much is it worth you not being on pay-per-view? Can I get 1.6 for not being on pay-per-view if you wanted to just be on the app? Oh, okay, yeah, I guess we can work around that. But I think if people listen to that conversation that took place, you can see how two people that were really at odds aren't really at odds, right? You know what I mean? They're not really at odds. And that was the beautiful thing of that. Now, this is what I got to say about why this makes PBC. I don't think it makes Al Heyman look bad. Actually, it makes Al Heyman look great because he does not have, that would have been very difficult for Terence Crawford to do that, right? Very difficult for Terence Crawford to enter into that type of conversation because Bob Arum might not have wanted it. Bob Arum might have been isn't going to tell Terence Crawford, oh, right, if you get a deal that you like, yeah, no worries. We can't work it on ESPN. Go over there to the zone, Terence. You can fight for one fight because I can't get you a better deal. But then come back on, yeah. And for your next fight, though, we'll have you back on Fox, right, dude? That's how Al Heyman looks like Al Heyman handled it. Excellent negotiator, dude. Excellent, open-minded cat that wants fighters to be able to work around and get the best deal that they can for themselves. So, excellent deal. But the reason that I say that the PBC is looking bad in this particular circumstances because of the inability for PBC to get a PBC fighter like Leo Santa Cruz to agree to fight Gary Russell Jr. Like, how much of a punk does this make Gary Russell Jr.? How bad does this make Leo Santa Cruz look? When Gary Russell Jr. and you heard it, only thing that Gary Russell Jr. asked to fight Devin Haney, he said $1.5 million in a rematch clause for you, not even for him. Gary Russell Jr. was willing to fight Devin Haney, the WBC lightweight champ, for $1.5 million with no rematch clause. And guess what else he didn't ask for? He didn't ask for Devin Haney to come down to 130, right? He didn't play any games, any weight games. From what I know, he's not talking anything about the gloves. He's not playing any games. He just said, I want to fight. You guys think I'm lying. I want to fight. And let me tell you something else that Gary Russell Jr. and those guys said on this comment, which is telling you, Josh Warrington, you looking bad. Leo Santa Cruz, you're looking bad. All you dudes that ain't fighting Gary Russell Jr., dude, don't act in any way, shape, or form like it's him. It's you, okay? It's you, without a doubt. It's you don't want that smoke from that dude. You don't want that smoke because Gary Russell Jr. to say against the 135-pound champ in WBC that he would rather listen to what he said, man. And to some people, it doesn't make sense, but it tells you the kind of person Gary Russell Jr. is. He said, look, man, 1.5 million, give me 1.5 million, and I'll give you a rematch clause. If I beat you, you get another fight. If you beat me, I don't want another fight. I go on about my business and I'll leave you alone. That's all that I want. That's all that I want. He said, and then he said so much so that, look, man, if I don't want the stipulations that you're asking me for, I'll just go the WBC. I can fight Javier Fortuna and we'll beat Javier Fortuna and we're going to be your mandatory. And we could get in a situation of getting to you through the mandatory. So my response was, but why would you do that? Because the mandatory split is so wide. Like, you're not going to make as much money. I told Gary Russell's team that. I was like, you don't make as much money on the mandatory, right? So why would you want to do it as a mandatory and not do it straight up as a voluntary with the options? He's like, man, because we only fighting you because we want to beat you up. That's it. We only talking to you. We only talking to Devin Haney because we want to beat Devin Haney. We want to fight Devin Haney. We don't care about the money. We want to beat him. And when we beat him, we want to be free. Dude, if somebody is willing to turn down that much money, take short money like that, take a chance, fight somebody as tough as Javier Fortuna, then just so that he can get to the champion without having to give options, dude, that tells you, number one, that guy thinks he's going to win the fight. And number two, that tells you that dude just wants to fight. He just wants to show he's the best. Dog, Josh Warrington, you looking terrible, man. Leo Santa Cruz, you looking terrible, man. Gervonta Davis, you looking terrible, man. Whole bunch of you PBC fighters, he's making you look terrible, man. Terence Crawford, he makes you look horrible. Like, horrible. Gary Russell Jr. made all you guys look bad by showing what he was willing to do in front of everybody, man. So don't know. And the whole thing started because he said that he's like, look, man, y'all ain't going to call me no ducker. You're not going to say that I'm ducking because I ain't ducking anybody. I'll take the fight. I don't want no games in the contract. When I whoop you, that's it. How much more true can you be than Gary Russell Jr. in that regard? And shout out to Devin Haney's team too, because they wanted to make the fight. They went out of their way to figure out how to, whole time people arguing and doing all this stuff, right? And it's cool. But Devin Haney, and I can see how both teams don't trust each other. That's reasonable. They're on opposite sides, right? So they don't trust each other. But I'm watching Devin Haney's team try to think through how they can position this stuff in a way that the network would buy it, right? Being flexible, right? Being consistent in the conversations. I mean, this the whole thing, man, just from the Gary Russell Jr.'s point of view and Devin Haney's point of view, man, those dudes, I certainly hope the fight goes through, but y'all fighters need to understand, man, Gary Russell Jr. is for real in his desire to show that he is willing to fight people. All y'all talk that smack about Gary Russell Jr. need to zip your lips because that dude was for real. And he, again, is moving up from featherweight to lightweight. Featherweight to lightweight to fight one of the hottest, most difficult young fighters in all of boxing. And he's willing to do it and give the young guy a rematch clause when he's not taking one. Come on, man. Come on. Don't ever say anything bad about Gary Russell Jr. Y'all saw it. Shout out to Devin Haney. Shout out to Team Devin Haney. Shout out to Gary Russell Jr. Hopefully these guys can get that all the way across, and hopefully other fighters can see it, man. Y'all need to work together to make these fights, man. Get on the phone with each other, work with each other, figure out what type of reasonable deal you guys can come up with, and then take it to your promoter and see, hey, man, the promoter, look, this is what we talked about. Promoter, are you cool with this? Can we make it work? Right? And put them out there in the middle of the street so that they have no choice. So that Bob Arum can't hide behind his office door, lowballing people or all that stuff got washed out when those guys did that stuff in front of everybody. Anyway, that's my take on the situation. You let me know what you think. And with that, I'm out. Peace.